going to invite the two panellists to the stage now. And our first speaker is going to be Matthew Margesson. He's got a presentation that he's going to do on the podium. He's from CAA International, which is basically the international arm of the UK Civil Aviation Authority. And it's quite topical, and it's quite good that he's here, because in Asia Pacific there's a number of civil aviation authorities that quite frankly have been struggling to keep up with international standards. The two that come to mind is Indonesia and the Philippines, which have both caught the attention of the European authorities and the US FAA. So part of Matthew Margesson's organisation is going out and helping regulators in the region, and also helping airlines in the region as well to meet certification and regulatory standards. So I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you, Leithen. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for your time this morning. I'm going to really approach this with two hats. One from my current role within CAA International and the UK Civil Aviation Authority, but also another hat that represents the 10 years I spent in commercial pilot training before joining the CAA. So a little bit about the UK CAA. It is the UK's aviation specialist regulator. It's broadly split between safety regulation, airspace policy, and consumer and environmental protection. It has a staff of around 1,000 people, is responsible for in excess of 65,000 licensed personnel in the UK and at least 100,000 overseas as well. Within the UK CAA is the international department. I'm joined by some of my colleagues in the audience here. And we provide access, coordinated access to the UK CAA's technical expertise. And that, as Leithen has said, is broadly split across technical assistance programs, training, and examinations. So we have an international network of exam centres for flight crew and aircraft maintenance engineers. We have an extensive portfolio of training services, effectively taking what we do as a regulator and being able to deliver that both to industry, to get into the mindset of the regulator, and of course to other regulators. And then technical assistance programs. So we've provided support to many, many national aviation authorities across 140 countries around the world. And that is capitalising on that expertise within the UK CAA. I thought as well what I'd do is highlight some of the forecasts. Numbers may be a bit here and there in places, but currently global aviation represents a $500 billion industry per annum, give or take a few billion. In the next 20 years, and these numbers have come from ICAO, in the next 20 years, they're looking to add around 25,000 new aircraft, new commercial aircraft, that is. Within Asia Pacific alone, in the next 3 years, that's 500 aircraft, and there's a backorder of around 3,200 aircraft, if memory serves me right. That has a profound impact on the supply of personnel to the industry, as you would expect. Conservatively, it's estimated that in the region of 450,000 new aircraft technicians will be required by 2026, and around 350,000 new pilots as well. And Asia Pacific represents roughly 20 to 30% of that demand. We always talk extensively about the supply of pilots and engineers, and I've been through 2 downturns in the industry and been exposed to the downturn in flight crew demand. But we can't forget that there's an extensive range of technical expertise supporting this industry, be that air traffic control and air traffic management, aerodrome operations and ground handling. I will stick, for the purposes of this forum, to flight crew, principally, but we shouldn't forget all of these other areas of the industry that also have to respond to the demands. I think the significant challenges facing the industry when it comes to their staff is actually the recruitment and the selection processes around the people that they employ, And then once you've got those people, how do you keep them? We're seeing, or have seen, extensive retirements. Succession planning has been relatively weak because there hasn't been the investment to support succession planning and training of individuals effectively. Clearly, there are peaks and troughs in the training capacity to support that demand. There has been a loss of significant experience to the industry as well. We feel that as a regulator. Accessibility to affordable training as well. It's an expensive business, training people. But actually, when you scale it up to the cost of buying aeroplane assets, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on buying aeroplanes. A very small percentage of that is a cost towards training. Learning methodologies, technologies have changed as well. So we need to keep pace with that as well. And that has an impact on keeping people stimulated in the job, giving them new challenges, giving them progression in role. We'll touch on competency and discipline of training. When you look at the training organizations across the world, there are varying standards. So competency training, work being conducted at the moment by ICAO, and the next generation of aviation professionals will have a bearing on this going forward. And of course, how attractive is the role now? Flight crew working longer hours, doing multiple sectors. Has the romance gone out of flying? Being able to attract people into the industry. I remember being invited into the cockpit as a child and being able to see what it was like to be up the front there. Those days are gone. And of course, maintaining competition against other skilled sectors as well, where terms and conditions, remuneration could be far more attractive. So how do we go about addressing the demand or the supply shortfall versus that demand? And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are peaks and troughs in that demand. The early 2000s to 2006, 2007, everybody spoke about a pilot shortage. And then the industry took a distinct downturn. And that gave respite to the airlines. That gave them an opportunity to regroup and reconsolidate, had to focus on other priorities. But we can't lose sight of the fact that human resource selection and planning tools need to be in place, and they need to be sustainable. And there's no silver bullet to fix this. There's a longer-term foundation for sustainable provision of staff, and there are other blended solutions that can help to support peaks and troughs as well. We need to look at innovative financing tools. Certainly, in the last 10 years, more and more emphasis has been put on the candidate, the trainee, to self-fund that education. Airlines have spent far less on supporting that. Sponsorship programs have all but disappeared completely. Of course, availability of finance from financial institutions has dried up as well. We need to see that there's global harmonization as well of training and licensing standards. That's happening quite considerably. We have to remember that this is a highly portable workforce. They will move to wherever the best packages are available to them. Terms and conditions of employment, tax-free lifestyles. We've seen a significant migration of very experienced crew to the Middle East, for example. So we need to also address cooperation between the airlines and the training organizations to make sure that all of the stakeholders involved are completely engaged and aligned and working towards that resource selection and those planning objectives. And make the job rewarding, make it stimulating, give them career development opportunities, provide management experience to pilots and training examiner experience. And probably one of the most significant factors to support addressing that demand is how the regulators regulate as well. And I'll touch on that a little bit more. Next slide. Oops, no, I won't. I'll come back to that regulation if I can. There's a significant move within the UK towards proportional oversight of organisations. We know that there are some good organisations and some not so good organisations. So we need to focus on the areas of most significant risk to us as well. But we also need to make it as trouble-free as possible to bring new organisations into the industry as well. So startup, we spoke about startup airlines in the last forum, being able to give organisations the opportunity to get a foothold in the market as well, to then create breathing space for more trainees to go through the system. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That was a great presentation. I'd like to invite to the stage Mr. Andy Young from AviationLearn, which is a Singapore-based company that's involved in helping airlines with training. Mr. Young.
Good morning, everybody. AviationLearn was found since 2003. During the times when we are facing technology changes, internet's coming in, it was still relatively low base. So how do we differentiate ourselves from the other training organizations? Is by focusing on the technologies, the emerging technologies, especially the simulation technologies. So this is how we differentiate ourselves as we foresee the challenges coming. Today, I'm very glad that Matthew had mentioned those areas that actually we are facing in Singapore, to more or less the same areas. We are facing the first open speech by David about the increasing of the rising of the new aircraft. About Boeing was talking about 33,500 in 20 years' times. Demanding for engineers, demanding for pilots, ranging from pilots about 500,000, and the engineers is about 650,000. So how do we, as an organization, training organization, face the challenge? How do we make sure that enough pilots around, engineers around? How do we ensure the instructors are around? And they must be competent and able to handle the new generation of Z generations, for example, who are used to internet, who are IT savvy and all that. So this is a challenge we're facing.
I was wanting to ask both our panelists, one of the issues in Asia Pacific and around the world, as we've discussed, is the shortage of, and the projected shortage of pilots and maintenance engineers in the industry. But it always seems to go in sort of ebbs and flows, where we have a situation where there's a huge shortage to the point where airlines are having to ground aircraft because of shortage of pilots or issues with their maintenance. And then it goes the other extreme, where there's an economic downturn, and then there's no issue with pilot shortage or shortage of maintenance engineers. How do you kind of, what's the way we're dealing with the troughs and the peaks in the industry to ensure that there's always going to be an adequate supply? Matthew, you able to?
Yeah, I don't think that's something that's ever going to go away. I think we'll always be faced with those challenges. I think what is key to this is approaching youth and catching people at a very young age, at an education level, to try and instill interest in them in becoming a professional aviator or an aircraft maintenance engineer, and then to be able to provide mechanisms to support their progression. Unfortunately, it is very much the case, of course, across this industry, that cost is a key driver. And, you know, £200,000 or dollars worth of training is considered to most airline operators a relative luxury. I'm not really answering your question, because I don't think there is a fix to this. I think we'll always see those peaks and troughs. But whether or not we can mitigate some of those with more proactive, more innovative programs, flexible crewing contracts, for example. I know that certainly within the UK there are training providers now that have developed a pool of flexible crew that they deploy to help take out those peaks and troughs.
Mr. Ung, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think I shared a view with Matthew. I belong to the so-called baby boom generations. During my time, when we look at the aviation, it is the in thing, the only thing that I am aspired to go into. But today, is aviation's jobs is the in things. How do we bring that juicy things into this industry to attract the young generation to join us? And that is a challenge. Okay. The other thing is about barrier. The barrier of cost is tremendous. If you look at today in local here, they're offered by the training organizations to train a pilot up to ATPL, how much it costs us? It's around 150,000. So is that high cost? Yes, it is high cost to the sales sponsor. But is it high cost to the airline? It's something that is debatable. Because if you look at the competency, a pilot that you want, and safe operations, then that 150,000 may not be a big figure.
Yeah, could I just add one other thing as well? I mean, the cost is such a significant barrier, and we have to find, as I say, innovative ways of being able to address that, because it is not an elitist occupation. It shouldn't be an occupation just for the rich and those that can afford to pay that kind of money. As a statement more than a...
Yeah, I think that is one of the key issues, because in the past, people would apply for a job at an airline and they would do a test based on whether they had an aptitude to be a good pilot, whether they had the personality, the right frame of mind, the right attitude to be a good pilot. But if you have a situation where to be a pilot you have to pay $60,000 then you're not really deciding your pilots based on aptitude, you're deciding on whether they have $60,000.
That's a very good point, and that's we have seen that trend as well quite significantly. So a lot of organisations perhaps may be more relaxed about selection and aptitude criteria for pilots, and it's more about somebody signing a cheque.
In terms of aptitude, is there any, does the CAA International, do you have any sort of tests that cover off that as well, covering that aspect?
No, we tend not to get involved in that, but there are tests out there for pilot aptitude testing.
I was also wanting to ask, and you mentioned how, if there's a downturn in one market, you could maybe redeploy some of the human resources into another market to cope with the peaks and troughs. In terms of, if you're a maintenance engineer or a pilot, you've got a certain certification. Like if you're in Singapore, you've got a certification which is recognised by the CAA, the Civil Aviation Authority here. If I want to go and work in the UK or work in Russia, then I need the regulatory authorities over there to recognise my Singaporean qualification. Has there been any progress in regulators recognising the qualifications and certifications of people coming from other markets?
Well, the answer is yes. We've certainly seen in overseas countries a significant move in the last few years towards EASA, European-based regulations. So, and that has created the demand for us around our exam centres overseas as well. So more and more national aviation authorities are looking towards the European model of licensing. And that is then creating that harmonisation. There are still national variances, of course, and making licence recognition a simpler process.
And Mr. Ung, I was wanting to, you mentioned in your presentation about the importance of simulation and how that's becoming more and more important. How do you see it evolving in future? And are there any pitfalls to using simulation so much in training?
See, that when we talk about training, we are talking about as far as possible, as real as possible, to the real environment. So, but on the other hand, if you use a real aircraft, which tie down your assets, and then the safety is another issue, then there's a challenge. How do we do it effectively and yet low cost? So simulation is the way to go, because simulation at least brings us nearer to the realisms, right? Simulation can train even more effective than the traditional method, because simulation does give the learner a different perspective of learning, which is not possible in the real things. So simulation is the way to go. Yeah.
I think a lot of people are probably familiar with flight simulators for training of pilots, but I understand there's a bit of a trend towards using simulators to train maintenance engineers. Are you able to discuss that a little bit?
Yes, yes, precisely. We always focus on the pilot simulator, full flight simulators and all that. But today there's a change. If you look up the 147s by ST Engineering, they have put in, they call it virtual maintenance training. Virtual maintenance training is a way to go where we inject simulation into maintenance training, where a person can learn the system and get simulated fault, how to troubleshoot, train up the troubleshooting skill and competency.
And Matthew, I had a question just in terms of, you mentioned in your presentation about the importance of getting trained and skilled instructors, and we all talk about the shortage of pilots and maintenance engineers, but there's also actually an acute shortage of instructors as well. In terms of the instructors for pilots, they're traditionally been very highly qualified, highly skilled pilots. Do you think that should always, do you think, because I did an interview once with Boeing and they had an idea, they gave the comparison of university lecturers. They said that because you're a lecturer in law, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that you were a lawyer for 40 years and became a lecturer. You get people who are lecturers who haven't necessarily worked in the industry. Is it possible, do you think, to maybe ease up the sources of flight training instructors so it's not always just about getting pilots?
I think there may be a possibility that less experienced instructors could be used in a training capacity. But I think what we need to be mindful of is not just the raw flying or the theoretical knowledge training requirements of a course and an experienced instructor's capability to support that, but the life experience that comes with that as well. So, having an experienced pilot instructor who's been exposed to an airline operation, is well versed in human factors and crew resource management, can relate scenarios very succinctly as well. That's a very, very positive learning tool.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, all that life experience counts for a lot. I guess the counter argument to that, though, is that you can have somebody who's got all that experience, but does that make them a good teacher? Like somebody who can go out and actually do it, but they can do it, but can they communicate that and teach others?
No, I mean, again, you're absolutely right there. Because you have those qualifications or because you have that work or life experience, that doesn't necessarily make you a good trainer. So there has to be a balance around who you select to do that job, as you have to select people to become pilots.
And with CA International, are you involved in sort of maybe providing trainers for the trainers per se? Are you able to go a little bit in detail on that?
Yeah, well, we don't necessarily provide training for flight instructors. That tends to take a different path, but training of trainers, sort of cultural awareness training, we provide activities that support that.
I guess another issue that I was wanting to discuss is getting the regulators in some countries up to speed. What's some of the issues that you're dealing with in helping these regulators? What's some of the things that you're coming up against?
Funding is one thing. A lot of these regulators are not particularly well funded, so they lack the staff resources as well, and they have a significant problem with retention of staff as well. They tend to go to industry or remain with industry because the rewards are significantly higher. But there is also a case of you don't know what you don't know as well. So a lot of regulators come to us because they have a problem and they can't quite identify what it is that they have a problem with or how they go about fixing that, how they go about addressing that, and how to engage with their industry to remedy that situation. And that's where we have to take them on a hand-holding exercise, if you like, and help them understand more about the regulations, about how they're applied in a practical sense as well, and how to take their own national industry on that journey with them.
Mr. Ung, I was wanting to ask you, how would, in terms of getting skilled people into regulatory bodies, you've got a situation where you might have a pilot who's making a lot of money working for Singapore Airlines, or a maintenance engineer that's making a lot of money working at an MRO. How do you persuade those sort of people to give up their high-paying jobs in the commercial aviation industry and go and work for a regulatory body? How do you persuade them to do that, do you think?
Yeah, in fact, I have the pilot captains who actually approached me and say he is very interested in teaching, in imparting knowledge. So he want to work out something with me. So now, I think in order to do that, we probably want to facilitate. Regulatory side can actually have a system whereby QFI can initiate himself and then get himself qualified in an independent way, you know. Today, it's still very much rely on the airlines, recognize them, and then give them the blessing to be instructors. The other way is talking about instructor quality. I think that traditionally, we are still facing a problem of how do we get our instructors from the ATPL is to time-based, hour-based. The guy might have, go back and then serve the flying hour in order to hit the hour then. And these people may not be passionate to be instructors. And yet, we make them to be instructors. You see? The other thing is the career. The career extension of career retirement age also makes the very effective instructors that go back to flying because it pays better there. So the career path, like what Matthew mentioned about, you must have a good career path for the instructor to attract them to come back to the instructor.
Yeah, because I think in some regulators, they're basically getting by relying on people that are retiring. And then a pilot retires, and then they go and join the Civil Aviation Authority. I know, for example, in Thailand, a lot of the people working there are retired Thai Airways pilots. But yeah, as the pilot shortage increases in Asia, retirement ages are increasing. So that pool of people cannot necessarily be tapped in future by the regulator. The other thing I was wanting to ask Matthew is in terms of government-to-government bilateral negotiations, how important, just generally speaking, do you think civil aviation matters are in the whole pecking order of bilateral agreements between governments?
I think, no, it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, the imperative for us as a regulator is to mitigate risks and to ensure safety in aviation. One of the significant drivers of change in our organisation, as I mentioned in my presentation, is proportional oversight and responding to that risk. So a very clear objective within that is closer relationships with other national aviation authorities and government-to-government activities, because those other national aviation authorities will have a pretty good idea where those risks are. And because it is a global industry, those risks are portable. They're moving around the world now into other territories. And we need to support the sort of education around that and the risk mitigation.
I guess in terms of risk mitigation, if people are moving from one country to another, is there still a record of their previous experience and flight hours and their reputation? Are you able to access that information if a pilot or engineer moves from one country to another?
There's the capability to do that NAA to NAA. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do. There's not a sort of central repository of data there. So it's very much a open dialogue from one aviation authority to another about a particular instance to be able to draw out that intelligence.
I guess another issue in terms of mitigating risk, we've seen a situation with some airlines in Asia, as they get bigger and bigger, it gets harder to sort of maintain, I guess, the high standards. We've had a couple of instances in the news with Lion Air, some of their pilots come into contact with the police over, use of drugs while flying. And I would imagine, when Lion first started out, if you only had 10 or 12 pilots, it's, you can you probably know every pilot personally, and you know who's good and who's not, and you get rid of the bad ones pretty quickly. But when you start dealing with 100, 200 pilots in your employ, how do you maintain standards and make sure that nothing like this goes amiss?
I think there's an inevitability with any business or organisation that as they grow, there is the potential dumbing down of standards within that organisation. So for us, it's about having very clearly defined process and procedures, and self-management, or in this case, safety management systems as well, to describe what it is you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and then to do that and evidence that you're doing that, to try and manage the process. And it's got to be scalable. But it's not an easy thing to do.
Mr. Ung, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think safety management is one way we can leverage on, in order to, because safety management insists that the stakeholder has to be accountable, right? So if airline has most airlines have implemented safety management. If they can incorporate the instructor program into the safety management, therefore they will be tied down together, accountable for the safety, and therefore the quality of instruction will rise.
We see a lot of airlines actually talk about this SMS, their safety management system. How is SMS evolving, Matthew?
I mean, within the UK, certainly we are progressing beyond a basic stage with SMS now to a more advanced application of that, but in parallel with quality management system. For us as a regulator, it's about ensuring that our industry is fully understanding of safety management systems and how to apply that, and to how to integrate that with other management tools that they have as well, their QMS or their fatigue risk management applications.
Well, thank you to both of our panellists. In the interest of time, I'm going to end the panel session, and I'd just like to say thank you to both our panellists. And it's interesting, this panel was about the shortage of pilots and the shortage of maintenance engineers, and we got onto the topic of safety, but that's good, because ultimately that's the most important thing, is maintaining high safety standards. So I'd like everyone to give our two panellists a warm applause, and thank you very much.